Hello, we're going to be looking at the value study, and we're going to be reviewing it in terms of plotting, how well you translated the contours from the reference photo to your drawing, the accuracy of the value scale, how well you translated the values from your reference source to your drawing, and also the physical requirements of the assignment. Keeping in mind that design is always going to have criteria, no matter what genre of design you're pursuing. There are criteria and boundaries and restraints. That's part of the creativity of being a designer, to create within those boundaries and to create with excellence. So let's take a look. So the photo is divided into the 8x10 half-inch squares, and then the grid is the inch size, twice the size of this. The plotting looks very accurate, including the degree of curvature on the vases. That's translated fairly well. The position of the forms within the design space overall is also accurate. The value scale is really light. We do have the paper represented here, but from white to this degree of value is kind of a short run. These are very similar, very short step. Then there's a bigger gap between the mid value here and the next one. And these two are very close, and then there's a big gap between this value and this one. So this is mostly on the high key end of value scale, and it could be a lot more evenly paced. And the idea of doing the value scale is to, first of all, understand the value of your working surface, the gray Canson paper, relative to what is white or 0% value, and to black, which is 100% value. And to also be able to use that value scale to help determine and estimate the values that are in the photograph so that you can translate them to the drawing. So the value scale needs a little bit of work. It needs to be more evenly paced between the lightest and the darkest. The translation of the values themselves, and part of the translation of values is to be able to use all the media that will get you where you need to go. So you were to use the Prismacolor pencils plus the white gel and a black marker to get the really rich dark black. So given the photograph and given the idiosyncrasies and the differences of this being a printed photo, the whole thing is a photo taken of a photo, and now we're viewing it on screen, there are obviously some shifting that's going to go on. But for the most part, what we can see is that the foliage in the photo is darker all around than the foliage in the drawing. So the darker value could be pushed a lot more. This edge is very telling. See how this edge, and I'll increase the scale. See how this edge is very dark in contrast with the background? And here, especially if you squint, that edge gets a little bit lighter, but kind of starts merging with the shadows that are on the floor. In other words, it gets a lot harder to see that edge than that edge. This is still clearly defined, and then it gets much easier to see, much more contrasty, then it starts losing contrast as it goes against the darker values of the floor. We're not seeing that here. So these values were not translated accurately. The core and the darker value in the form shadow here are translated fairly well. The lighter values in the central light area against the background here are translated fairly well. The floor is overall much darker than what is indicated here. The blue is much darker than what's indicated here. So let's just grab this and let's move it so we can directly compare. So you see where the values should be? Look at the value of the floor. It's fairly close to this, especially right in there. The values here are fairly close. Let's compare over here. See how distinct the black is So the values could be translated a lot more accurately. So the plotting is working. The resulting drawing communicates well on its own. But if we're comparing to the reference photo, it has a ways to go. Remember that value contrast is the reason we see form. That's the Gestalt principle of irradiation, contrast of light and dark. To create the illusion of volume, for those of you who are visual developers or illustrators or animators, for those of you who are realistic fine art painters, even for those of you who are photographers and graphic designers and industrial designers, the more contrast between light and dark that you have, the easier things are to see. And the easier they are to see, the easier they are to understand. So this one, in terms of the plotting, the initial grid in this, the plot lines, are barely visible. So the spirit of the assignment in terms of translating value for value from a reference source to a drawing was understood. The plotting is fairly accurate. We can barely see a plot line there and one there, and we can see how things relate. The value scale itself is pretty even. It could go darker. In other words, you could probably lose one of these two lighter bits, and doesn't look like the paper is actually, oh, actually it is. The paper here is represented. This is presented on a darker ground. The value of the paper looks to be like it's maybe right in here, but you should have a darker value here. In terms of the value translation, there's some really subtle reflected light areas. There's not a lot of light banking off the background and giving her any fill in the shadow areas in the photo. And that same idea is kind of caught here in terms of there's very little fill light. Probably this is too harsh, and the more accurate things are, the more we can kind of pick out the details. And so there are a few things that could be improved upon. The contour right in here and the shape of that form shadow to actually help define the shape of the arm. This arm works a lot better, but it's not a straight line coming down. There is some undulation as the shadow runs over the contour of the arms. We have kind of an integration between foreground and background, or figure and ground right in here. Very distinct, explicit line right here. Probably don't need the little darker outline right there because there is, again, an integration because of the value into the background. But overall, this is working fairly well. Okay, looking at this one, first of all, do not get between the light source and the surface that you're photographing. So looking at the plotting, what's going on here is that there are things that are happening in the drawing that aren't happening in the photograph. There's a symmetry of the face that isn't quite caught here. The distance between the eyes isn't accurately plotted. The nose is actually too far to the right. It should come down on this line right here. The other thing that I noticed, and it was the first thing I noticed, is this shape right here is not translated here. So this shadow it goes up, it peaks, and then it runs down. So this should be doing the same thing, because that collar has a lift on it that is not being translated well. The shoulder line the collar line should be coming out to about there, and the shoulder line coming down maybe about there. And then this is an interesting thing because here we have a point, but we don't have the point here. So one of the reasons for the grid is, first of all, it's a drawing aid. It helps you sight as you're drawing from the reference. It also divides the space that you're working in and gives you an understanding of a height to width or a length to width ratio. The first thing designers need to know how to do, the first thing illustrators need to know how to do, is deal with the space. The first thing they need to do with any design is understand how much space they have to work with and what is the height to width proportion. Interior designers and industrial designers often deal with grid systems and ergonomic systems that are proportional, their height to width or height to width to depth. And this is basically a very soft introduction to that concept that we have space, we measure space, space is measured distance. The proportional ratio gives us the overall amount of space we have to work with. And you can't design a 10 by 10 foot room in a 10 by 12 foot space. It's not the same thing. So you have to translate directly. So when we're talking about an 8 by 10 grid and translating that from 50% or half scale to full scale, full size, and we want to make sure things land where they need to be for accuracy, because that's one of the points of this. It's very important to do that. It's very important to work on getting the accuracy correct. Sometimes people in this assignment will go ahead and just draw directly from the reference on top of the grid without addressing the grid and how they're positioning the contours. And that may be what happened here. So if we squint at this, the value of the hair is working pretty well. It could be a little darker down in here. Kind of burn that in a little bit more. Burn this in a little bit more. The shape of this actually comes out more and then tucks in. So the paper looks like it's represented right here. The lighter values are a little too light on their way to the black. These two are okay. This could be a little more robust. Just done with a lot more confidence. There's a big jump between the middle value here and the next one. Very little difference between these three. Okay, and the last one we'll look at, and I'm not sure what happened with the plotting here, if this is just the way it was photographed. It looks like we're missing the top of the grid over here, because this is definitely rectangular and this is a square, so even if this is photographed at an angle, which I think it probably was, there should be the next grid line up here representing the top edge of the image. So I'm not sure what happened there. So the value scale is not bad. It again could be more robust and filled in. And again, because it is a gauge for you to estimate the values that are in the photo and be able to translate them with some accuracy to the drawing. Looking at the plotting, the shoulders, arms, and torso seem to be plotted okay. You know, there's a comfortable degree of accuracy there. The neck is looking okay. The head is looking a little squeezed. The ears should be moving back over this direction. There's more of that. The hair should be a little more filled in, and it's fairly dark. The angle is an up angle, and that was caught pretty well. So we get the perspective on that comfortably. What we don't have in the drawing is the dark area here, the corner, the strongly defined shadow, which is a good strong mid-value shadow, and here it's really light. And of course this shadow here, which is actually softer. So this is kind of the primary shadow, and this becomes the secondary shadow. So in terms of translating the values, more could be made of really pushing the values, the darkness of the values, and again use marker. If you have gouache, you can use gouache to really darken things down, get the dark shadows. It looks like the value of the lighter areas of the shirt are about the value of the shadows along the jaw and under the eye. This is way too light for what's going on here. and that light area, that center light area, is not in the same position as it is here. So that's it, and let me know if you have any questions.